All right, everyone. Welcome to the first screencast, or the only screencast for Chapter 1. It's a very short screencast to kick off the Shepsley book material, and he calls this chapter "It's not rocket science." It's not really rocket science, except when it is rocket science, because there are certain aspects of macroeconomics that I took in grad school where we actually did use the mathematics that were invented, or the mathematical modeling techniques that were invented to shoot rockets to the moon. So we like to say in that macro class that we were rocket scientists, rocket scientists from the 50s and 60s, but rocket scientists nevertheless. But this chapter just serves as kind of to give us all the lay of the land of where have things been in terms of how we as social scientists have thought about analyzing politics, and where things are going. So a little bit of a history of thought here. So there's been a dramatic change in the study of politics over the past 50 years, and especially over the past 30 or 40 years. So where we've moved is from describing to explaining. So from just merely getting what many of us would think of as a historical account of politics. This person was Thomas Jefferson was a rival with John Adams, and kind of a descriptive explanation of how things happened, to trying to come up with ways to analytically think about explaining some of the underlying incentives of what's going on. And often a lot of analysis of politics has gone from judging or being reform-minded to analyzing. So from more of a normative way of thinking about politics, what should be, to a more positive way of just trying to say, well, can I understand things as they are? And it's really important, even if you are someone who has some normative thoughts about how politics should change, you should really understand the way things are first. It would be like trying to build an airplane without first understanding gravity. You really do need to understand the physics of aerodynamics and gravity before you try to design something that's going to try to subvert gravity and things like that. And another big change in the study of politics has been from qualitative to quantitative. And there's been a big shift on the political science side, especially economics made this transition a little bit earlier from primarily a qualitative discipline to a quantitative discipline. One of the things I love about political science, I was in political science departments in graduate school, and my first two jobs were in political science departments. I still go to political science conferences. Do a lot of work with political scientists, is that it's a really big tent discipline. They have a lot of qualitative people, quantitative, empirical, behavioral, institutionalists. They bring a lot of different guns to bear on the problems in social science. In fact, one of my favorite social scientists is Eleanor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Prize in economics several years ago, and she's a political scientist, and that's the hallmark of her research is she studies tragedy of the commons, common pool resource problems, and is that she brings all of the different techniques in the academy, really, philosophy, anthropology, law, you name it, just about, to trying to understand social science issues. But there has definitely, within the study of politics, been a big growth in the use of quantitative methods and somewhat less use of qualitative methods. So what were the olden days like? Well, pre-World War II, there was a lot of thick description, a lot of facts, a lot of narrative, a lot of description of the way different bills became law, the way different politicians strategically tried to get things done. There was what we would recognize today as more modern social science. There's a lot of stuff about incentives. There's a lot of verbal modeling going on in some of these descriptions. Someone log rolled, right? They traded a vote on this issue for a vote on that issue. We would now call that log rolling. But just lots and lots of facts, right? But not a lot in the way of analysis. This is pre-World War II. And then this method was called thick description. So it was very careful. There was a lot of detail, maybe to a fault. Sometimes things that are too detailed sometimes don't give you any generalizability to other situations, right? You can think back to that map metaphor that we're using. If a map is very, 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 very detailed, let's say it's a map of vegetation, it's almost like a satellite picture of something. Well, it might be hard to find the roads. It might be hard to find the sidewalks. It might be hard to find trails if it's hyper detailed in terms of vegetation. And comprehensive. Every detail was mentioned just about. That also meant it was kind of indiscriminate. What's an important fact and what's not an important fact for understanding a particular reason that a bill passed, or a particular reason that a politician won, or a particular reason that voters rejected a particular ballot initiative. And it was primarily qualitative. There may have been some numbers in terms of counts and things like that, but primarily it was a qualitative, what a lot of us would think of as more historical way of doing things. Although modern history, in modern history departments, they're full of people doing quantitative work. But for a lot of us that aren't in the discipline of history, we tend to think of history as being more qualitative and descriptive. And that's exactly what this study of politics was like. It was descriptive and judgmental. A lot of reformist sentiments, a lot of things like, oh, the Speaker of the House has too much power, we should reform that. There was a lot of stuff about the dominance of congressional committees, which at the time were dominated by members of Congress who had the most seniority. A lot of those people pre-war and even post-war up until the 70s were Southern Democrats who tended to be a lot more conservative than their Democratic counterparts. Tended to be a lot more conservative than a lot of the academics who were analyzing the politics, who wanted more reform and more things passed. Those congressional committees were dominated by these conservative Southern Democrats. And so there was a lot of that in the literature that analyzed American politics at the time. A lot of things about how the filibuster in the Senate was anti-democratic. We still hear that sort of thing now in the modern context. And about the influence of lobbyists. And that has only grown, that sort of judgment and normative concerns about politics. And often reforms were advocated as part of the description. The description, all of this was almost activist in nature, in terms of, here, let me tell you this story about how the filibuster blocked this policy that I think should be passed, and therefore I think we should reform the filibuster. So some of this is great, and there's still people who do work like this, and it's great, and I like the texture of it, but what are some of the issues with it as the only way of really looking at politics? Well, some of the problems are it does little in the way of explaining, right? Well, how did the problem arise, right? There's also often little defense of the proposed reforms. The reforms that are proposed by these folks rarely receive the same scrutiny as the real world. There's a political scientist or economist, Mike Munger, at Duke University in the political science department there. He often calls this unicorn social science, where you take the real world and then you compare it to your idealized, perfect unicorn of a policy. And always the real world is going to lose, and your reform is going to seem better. But he says that's unfair, right? You have to compare the policy you want or the system of government you want, imagining if the politicians that we have were in that system, right? That's his little thought experiment of unicorn politics. That wasn't done in this pre-war analysis of politics. And often people didn't say a whole lot about why was the reform better? Not why has, but why was the reform better? An economist named Ronald Coase, he was talking about a different field. He was talking about what's called the old institutionalism. If you notice on our textbook, on the cover, it says it's part of the new institutionalist field. Coase here is a new institutionalist, and he was talking about the old institutionalism in economics, which was very much like this pre-war analysis of politics. It was a bunch of facts, very descriptive, very reform-oriented, but not a whole lot in terms of thinking about the underlying logic. And so I think his description of that old institutionalism applies to pre-war analysis of politics. And he says it's a mass of descriptive material waiting for a theory or a fire. It's unclear how helpful it is in terms of understanding the underlying dynamics of politics and how reforms might change that, right? You need a model, even if it's just a mental model, to think through why your reform to the existing political system might be better. And here's just my little footnote saying that he was talking about old school institutionalism, but the problem was more or less the same. And then so what happened after World War II was we got the behavioralist revolution in political science. This happened throughout the 50s and 60s. So this got much, much better at description. It got a lot more discriminating in terms of what sort of facts were important, what sort of details were important, and we got the emergence of empirical political science, emergence of statistical methods. A lot of this was centered around the University of Michigan. This is where the American National Election Study started. They started doing mass polling across the United States in systematic ways using verified statistical best practices. There were polls done earlier, but this is where a lot of, if you were a political science student in a PhD program, in the behavioral side of things, the more empirical side, looking at voting behavior and things like that, this is where your world starts. Lots of data collection, lots of good statistical analysis. But still not so much in terms of looking at causal mechanisms underneath, right? They were looking at how variables moved together or moved in opposite directions, but not a lot in terms of the underlying, what is the logic of why when the economy does better, why do incumbents tend to do better at the polls? Now that's a pretty easy one. We all have a mental model of why that might be. If times are good, you tend to want to keep the people in charge who are in charge. But there are a lot of more complicated issues within politics that may need more complex models. And so we think of this in science and social science as the why problem, right? Why is the principal interrogative question of science. Why do things happen, right? Empirical patterns by themselves don't always answer the why, right? Why do incumbent legislators seem to get reelected so frequently? Why do countries that use proportional representation have so many political parties? Why do democratic states so rarely go to war against other democracies? We see those empirical regularities in the real world, but why? Where are they coming from? And this is where in social science, in the late 60s, early 70s, we hit the rational choice revolution. And this is where we get really quickly 4 books that kind of altered the discipline of the study of politics. We get Kenneth Arrow's Social Choice and Individual Values. We get Anthony Downs' An Economic Theory of Democracy. We get James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock's The Calculus of Consent. And we get Mansur Olson's The Logic of Collective Action. I would also probably put Lynn Ostrom's study of a book called Governing the Commons on this list also, although it came a little bit later than these. Each of these set forth a set of models to analytically examine political phenomena. Ken Arrow is looking at voting. He's looking at group decision making. This was actually his dissertation. Ken Arrow went on to win the Nobel Prize for a lot of things, but primarily for his work on social choice. Anthony Downs, this is where the median voter theorem is first popularized. The economic theory of voting is first popularized. What's often called the paradox of voting is first popularized. Buchanan and Gordon Tullock in The Calculus of Consent founded the public choice school within economics. Buchanan and Tullock called this studying politics but without romance. The idea is to treat voters and politicians and political institutions the same way we treat consumers, firms, and other institutions within economics, to think about them in the same way, as being goal-oriented, as having incentives, as having things that give them reasons to do different things, and if the incentives change, we might expect their behavior to change. And the calculus of consent is really a collection of a lot of different models, many of them verbal. Buchanan was not known for highly mathematical work, but it was a first approach at approaching some of these questions in terms of thinking about politicians as being maximizing some sort of maximizing something in the same way we think of consumers maximizing utility and firms maximizing profit. And then Mansur Olson, the logic of collective action, he's asking a question about, well, sometimes we have groups who all want the same thing and they still don't manage to get that thing done. What's going on there, right? And he uses a lot of labor examples. So, for example, we're all plumbers and we all want higher wages. And so we decide, let's go on strike. Let's go on strike as plumbers. Or maybe we work in a manufacturing plant. Well, there's a problem there. We want higher wages, but if we go on strike, we don't get paid, right? And so Olson talks about labor unions as an example of a solution to the collective action problem. But that's just one example. The book goes into a lot of other details there. But anyways, this set of 4 books that all came about from 1951 to 1965 really sort of began what is known as the modern study of political science, especially the rational choice tradition. And now not everything that came after this is purely rational choice in terms of assuming rational agents, but much of it does. And so this is where we get this birth of these types of models. And there were mathematical models of voting before Arrow, but this is sort of where all this kind of critical mass of research all coalesced together. All of these people were aware of one another, aware of each other's work. And then William Riker founded the political science department, or reformed the political science department at the University of Rochester, and he sort of made these books the new textbooks. And from that, a lot of the, at least on the political science side, that's where a lot of this stuff came from. On the economic side, a lot of it comes from Buchanan and Tulloch and their work with the different public choice institutes that they had at the various schools they were at. But in any event, this is where a lot of this started. And the idea was to think about models of politics, models as purposefully stripped down, simplified maps that we can use to understand the real world, which is often too complex. And what we're going to see in this class is we're going to have just a few elementary models, and they're going to be able to take us a long way toward understanding a lot of relatively complex phenomena. And so that's all I'm going to say about that so far. The previous lecture talked about models as maps and how we can judge models. And so I'll just leave that there. I told you this was a short one to get us kicked off with the Shepley material. And that is all for now.